Okay. Okay, so welcome to today's program, a conversation with Sarah McLaughlin on her new book, Authoritarians in the Academy. We're going to discuss how foreign authoritarian governments are influencing restraints on free speech and academic freedom in American universities. Today's program is jointly sponsored by Harvard Alumni for Free Speech and the MIT Free Speech Alliance. I'm John Evangelakos, the president of Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. Harvard Alumni for Free Speech is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan group formed by Harvard alumni to defend and promote free speech, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity within the greater Harvard community. Our plan for today is to have a conversation with Sarah on this very important subject. If any of you have questions, please enter them in the chat feature, and I will do my best to work them into the conversation. I'm going to turn this over to Peter Bonilla now, and he's going to speak about our other sponsor, the MIT Free Speech Alliance, and also introduce Sarah. Peter?
Good afternoon. Thanks, John. Well, as John said, my name is Peter Bonilla. I am the executive director of the MIT Free Speech Alliance, which is essentially, as John described, the mission of the Harvard Free Speech Alliance. We are essentially their counterpart, focusing our efforts on the MIT community, which we do through public programs, debates, lectures, conferences, and other events open to all members of the MIT community. I'm very happy for MFSA to be partnering with Harvard Alumni for Free Speech on this event. I look forward to more such collaborations in the future, and I thank John for inviting us to take part. And I'm very excited to introduce my friend Sarah McLaughlin as today's guest speaker. Sarah and I were longtime colleagues at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. As we were just talking about, she's coming up on 14 years with the organization, which is about the same amount of time that I was at FIRE myself. So I had many overlapping years with Sarah, and I have watched a little bit from afar as she has increasingly, over the past years, built her profile as a sought-after expert on international free speech and international higher education issues. I'm very proud of her on the publication of her book, Authoritarians in the Academy, out from Johns Hopkins University Press, available in multiple reading formats. I highly encourage you to pick it up. It's a terrific read, a terrific culmination of Sarah's many years of research and activism on this issue. So Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And I thought for my first question to get this discussion started, I would love to hear from you about your trajectory in the free speech world and how it culminated in this book, how you came to FIRE many years ago, back before the organization shifted its focus more broadly, not just to American higher education, but to broader free speech issues, and also international free speech issues. I'd love to hear how your interest in the subject was kindled and how that all came together in the research and publication of this book.
Well, first off, thanks to both of you for having me here. I'm so pleased that you're interested in my book and the themes discussed in it. And so, to your first question, Peter, what kind of led me to the many years that created this book was when I first started at FIRE. I was actually an undergrad intern at Drexel University in Philly. I stayed on FIRE part-time, and then when I graduated, I came on to FIRE working on our kind of what was our bread and butter then and still is to a certain extent, our campus case team. And Peter remembers some of that very well because he was my boss at the time. But we spent a lot of years at FIRE just working in the traditional campus free speech and academic freedom cases that I think a lot of people are familiar with, the pretty common controversies, campus issues, speech about race, gender, abortion, foreign policy. These things have all, been pretty high profile speech controversies for decades and decades in the US. And sometimes grabbed a lot of headlines in the process. But what I was seeing over the years and years that I was working on these cases was that there was something that was kind of a quieter free speech crisis that was happening on campus. And it didn't necessarily get as much attention because it didn't have some of, the red meat that people like to see in these campus controversies. It didn't have something that they were super familiar with or that they had a very strong opinion on necessarily. But it was actually international speech issues starting to seep into American higher ed and actually creating, really disturbing, in my view, acts of censorship around especially the Chinese government. So I spent years working on these cases, talking to students and professors, especially international students, who were starting to feel like they could not speak freely on American campuses. And there's actually some overlap with other reasons why people feel that they can't speak freely on college campuses. But there's something a little bit unique about it. And it's essentially the way that foreign governments' sensitive political issues have been imported into American censorship controversies. So that's what inspired me to write this. And I think, it gets more pressing by the day. I write about this a lot, as Peter said, but the world is a very, very unfree place. Censorship is getting worse, basically every marker. And so this is something that's going to stay with us a long time. Higher ed is global, and free speech is being aggressively censored around the world. So this is something that we really need to start to respond to because it's not going to go away on its own.
Maybe, Sarah, it was a terrific book and there were a lot of different threads in there. Part of, I think, maybe would be helpful to people to understand some of the activities, that what's going on in American campuses. And in my mind, there are kind of there are many different elements here, but one is there are cases where universities are kind of seeking out these foreign governments and maybe unwittingly or worse, kind of inviting this kind of influence or worse. In other situations, it seems like this is happening to them, and maybe they're not understanding, or maybe they're just failing to do enough to deal with some of these pressures. So maybe you could just highlight for the participants here, our audience, what's going on.
Yeah, so that's a great way to frame it. And there's sort of the way you can look at it is speech issues caused by universities expanding abroad. What happens when a university decides they want a brick and mortar campus in China? What happens when they decide they want to open this new institute in the UAE? So that's kind of what happens when universities expand abroad and then by their own volition, see what happens there. And then the other side is what kind of comes here because of the movement, especially of students. And so there's been a lot of conversation about international students and their free speech, which I'm sure we'll get into more. But it's what happens when students who come to the US by the hundreds of thousands bring with them their own free speech issues. We've had cases where students, especially students from China who are supportive of the Chinese government, think that they have the authority to censor speech about the Chinese government that they don't like. And that's something that maybe universities haven't been fully prepared for as they've expanded to include so many international students as part of their student body. But I want to turn back a little bit to your first question, to how universities have kind of courted these problems abroad. And I think a great example for this is satellite campuses. To me, some of the most disturbing examples have been from universities that have opened satellite campuses in Qatar. But essentially, it boils down to the question of who's in charge at these campuses. And for many, many years, American universities have said they are the ones in charge. They're setting the rules. They are bringing over the same values and commitments that they had on their American campuses. But the trickle has started in recent years, and it's become clear that's actually not the case. American universities are not actually in charge there. And if you think about it, it was a little bit silly to ever assume that an American university opening up a campus in an authoritarian country would be the one setting the rules there. Uh, with Northwestern University, there was some especially alarming developments about their campus in Qatar. A few years ago, they had invited a musician to speak on campus as part of an event. This musician was gay, and in Qatar, that is a criminal offense. And so they decided to cancel it. They said there were security concerns. They said we'll hold this event another time elsewhere, but we have to protect the campus security. But then the Qatar Foundation, which is a state-linked body, which is the partner of all of these American universities that open campuses there, they issued their own statements and they said that's not what happened. We told them to cancel this event because it didn't correlate with our laws and our customs. And so not only did Northwestern not stand by its commitments in that country, it also appeared to have lied to everyone about what exactly happened and who made the decision to cancel that event. And so there are more things like that. Georgetown, they canceled a debate about blasphemy because guess what? Qatar has a blasphemy law. And so ultimately, these are the things that universities need to account for. There's a lot of money and prestige to be made by becoming a global institution. You can get a lot of money from the Gulf states if you expand campuses there, if you create ties. But what are you selling in exchange for that? And it turns out, to a certain extent, it's going to be universities' free speech protections. And that's not really something they're willing to account for.
So, Sarah, I mean, I guess at this point, there's not much you can do once you have a campus in one of these places, unless you shut it down. There's really not that much you can really do, right?
Sure.
So, what's the answer you should just be kind of understand all this and be more honest and upfront about it, and not do it, or maybe not do it, or at least admit that you're gonna follow the local laws and regulations, or should these American universities pull back? I mean, what's the kind of where are we kind of in this situation?
It's a good question, and I think sometimes it will really depend on the kind of program. If you have an economics program, maybe it's going to face different censorship issues than a liberal arts versus a medical school. So it is going to be a case by case thing, but at minimum, there needs to be honesty and there needs to be transparency. We can't be opening these campuses promising students and faculty that there's going to be protections for their rights and then pulling the rug out from under them when they get there. And I think we should expect a certain level of honesty from universities that students of certain religious backgrounds, sexualities, they might actually go to prison for expressing those things in certain countries where universities expand. So yeah, at a minimum, be honest with your students because they need to know what's actually going to happen to them if they go to these campuses and suddenly find out that they're not as free as the universities had promised them. And I think, for the ones that are already in existence, at minimum, we need the honesty and transparency, but we also need to at least know what these universities will do if they get an order from a government official saying, censor this, do that. We need to know publicly how they're going to respond to these things. So at minimum, they have to just be telling us the truth about what's going on, because we can't really account for the good and the bad that these satellite campuses create when we don't know what the bad actually is that's happening. Some of these things we never would have known about. For example, if the Qatar Foundation had not issued its own statement, we might not have known that Northwestern wasn't telling the truth. So that's the bare minimum, I think.
Sarah, something else I wonder, I'll ask this one more question about satellite campuses and then maybe we'll move on to some of the many other topics in the book. But one thing I wonder is, a lot of the satellite campuses built abroad, by Yale, by NYU, by Duke, by Northwestern, by a number of other places. These are satellites that came online in the last 10 or 20 years when at you know when the world was a little freer and a little bit more open to these kinds of cross-border collaborations. And I think now, I think, now compared to 10 or 15 years ago when you might have been able to open one of these without much controversy, there's a lot of heat on any university opening a campus in, say, a Gulf state. It's almost impossible to imagine now a university, pursuing a collaboration with China for any number of geopolitical reasons. Just the politics and the landscapes have changed so significantly. So I wonder, and maybe you know this, maybe you've studied this more. Are these kinds of collaborations things that American universities are pursuing fewer of now, or is the temptation still pretty strong to build these kinds of satellites?
I think the temptation is still pretty strong. There are, especially with China, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of heightened scrutiny from federal and state officials about these campuses, about ties between universities and China more broadly. I think some of those concerns have been justified, some less so, some in the middle. It's messy, and there are a lot of things that we don't know about U.S. relationship with China in the next few years. I think this is going to be an entirely different question. For example, if China does invade Taiwan, I don't know that that's going to have to change the calculus to a certain extent. And I think a few universities have been pulling out of Qatar, for example, but the desire for this kind of expansion has not disappeared at all. And to me, what's especially notable is at least two universities have signed agreements to open campuses in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, which, just a few years ago, brutally executed a journalist who was living in the United States when he was in a consulate in Turkey. So I think that we might be past the shame portion of that, where there's concerns about it, and part of that is because it's something that Saudi government has been working so aggressively on. I mean, buying up international sporting leagues, hosting the Riyadh Comedy Fest. I think there has been a concerted effort to, make that an accepted thing, regardless of, perhaps human rights issues that might be associated with it. But again, with higher ed, it's always going to be a different question than professional golf or comedy, because it's going to be about, academic freedom, the knowledge we produce, the debate we can have. So while I'm still concerned about the Comedy Fest, I'm even more concerned about higher education. So may it change a little bit? Yes, but that desire for expansion is not gone at all. And I think we'll also see more in India as well too, which has been trying to increase its market for international higher education, and it certainly has the population for it. And it has its own academic freedom issues. So the problem's not going away, but it just might change a little bit.
Hey, Sarah, we actually had a question from one of us listening, and they asked whether FIRE is working on any issues with any students in these foreign campuses.
So we have been in touch. We've written letters occasionally about these campuses. If any students are at an American university and their speech rights are being violated at those universities, please reach out to us. I'd be happy to let our campus case team know, and they can look into it. Depending on what kind of speech commitments that university offered, it's definitely something we would look into.
Great. Maybe can we pivot, I think, to the United States. I think, and there are a lot of questions, but I think one is how much of this foreign influence is seeping into the United States, more importantly for me, more interesting, a lot of your book focuses on the People's Republic of China and, what's going on in terms of controlling particularly Chinese students and people, expats who've left. And it's not really clear to me in your book. It sort of suggests some of them may be just very enthusiastic foreign, Chinese students in the U.S. Some of it may be people who are actually being instigated by the Chinese government. And some of them may be people who are acting at the behest of the Chinese government in order to protect themselves or to curry favor, or obviously some combination. So it was a fascinating part of your book. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, central to this issue is the CSSA. So that's the Chinese Students and Scholars Association chapters. They're at campuses all across the country, and CSSAs. There's nothing inherently wrong with student groups that organize around shared background or interests or values, but in most cases, if there has been some kind of censorship controversy on a campus about China, these CSSA chapters have been involved. So they very often tend to be publicly, to some extent, hyper nationalists in their support of the Chinese government. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, for students who are Chinese students to be seen as members and be seen as supportive and interactive with these groups. Because their fear is that if you're not supportive of the CSSA chapters, what does that mean? Are you a critic of the government? So, what happens with these groups is that they have been contacting universities to get speakers disinvited and canceled when they don't like the speaker's views on the Chinese government. And most often, those speakers tend to be Tibetan, Uyghur, or Hong Kong speakers who, essentially come from groups that the Chinese government has been trying to target and censor in recent years. And what's been especially fascinating to me is the reliance on language around sensitivity that I think these groups have been using. They've said to university leadership that it's hurtful, offensive, insensitive, biased for them to allow speakers who hold these views about China to come speak on campus. There was a particularly interesting example at the University of Chicago a few years ago, where Nathan Law, who was an exiled Hong Kong democracy legislator, he was going to be part of a speaker series at UChicago. And the CSSA chapter there wrote to the university and said that this was hate speech, it wasn't protected by free speech, and that the university had to act, or that they were going to tell other students not to attend the University of Chicago. And there's, an interesting insinuation there. Universities are increasingly reliant on international student tuition. So the idea is, if you allow these speakers who hold views about the Chinese government, maybe you won't have any more students from China who tend to pay more tuition than citizens. Maybe you won't have any more students attend here. So that's something that we've been seeing a lot. And as you suggested, it's kind of difficult to know. To what extent is this perhaps government sponsored? To what extent is this just a very zealous student who's expressing their beliefs? And, is there ever anything sort of in between? And obviously, sometimes it is just students who passionately believe this. But we do know that there have been certain times when Chinese consulates have actually been working directly with CSSA chapters to lobby universities to censor speech, censor speakers, cancel events that are critical of the Chinese government. And it's fascinating the way that that's turned out, because 20 years ago, it would have been the Chinese consulates doing that directly. That was something we saw a lot in the early 2000s. Chinese consulates directly calling university presidents and saying, "Are you sure you want to host this Tibetan speaker on your campus? That's not a great idea." But now we know that at least in some cases, they're privately working with student groups on campus to get that message through. So it's interesting to see, how that's perceived as a more effective tactic now, perhaps by the Chinese government.
Yeah. I have a question from the audience, which bears on this. So let me read that, just because I want to get the nuance right. So if a student from China complains to discrimination, that a faculty member is engaged in national origin discrimination by criticizing the Chinese government, do investigators have the analytical tools to distinguish that from other national origin, ancestry, ethnicity complaints?
Well, that's a great question because um, I think that that's something that universities have been uniquely bad on when they have gotten these things. That's why I've been using this term sensitivity exploitation in the book, because I think sometimes students are exploiting these existing pathways to report discrimination or bias on their campuses. For example, at George Washington University, I can go into this a little bit longer, but ultimately the university investigated artwork that was critical of the Beijing Winter Olympics a couple of years ago. And the students contacted the university through a couple of different ways, but one of which was through the bias response organization within the university. And they were actually offered mental health resources and promised an investigation into this. But what's been really fascinating, I think, is, if you look at things like the Stop Woke Act in Florida, for example, we can see how the carelessness of, certain attempts to restrict speech on campus through, the idea that we can't make students feel bad about who they are, where they come from, we can see how that could be used in a situation like this. Students might say, I shouldn't have to sit in a classroom where I'm told horrible things about where I come from. That is biased against me and unfair. So it's a messy question, but it's a messy issue, but a good question.
So are there, I guess, there must be universities that are better and worse at this? I mean, without, where I guess since we're particularly focused on Harvard and MIT here, where do they stand on these sorts of issues? Or I mean, is there, or can you tell, is there enough data to kind of come to any kind of conclusion?
Harvard has been one of the worst actors on this issue in my experience. There was a really high profile controversy that came out a couple of years ago. And it first happened in 2015, but didn't come out until a few years later. But ultimately, a scholar, a Chinese dissident scholar who was at Harvard, I believe through Scholars at Risk that year, he was attempting to host an event about human rights abuses in China, while Harvard's president at the time, Drew Faust, was actually going to be in China and meeting Xi Jinping. And so he was actually contacted by a vice dean at Harvard Law who told him that this would embarrass the university to hold an event about human rights in China while Harvard's leadership was there. And so he was actually pressured and forced to cancel that event. And that's exactly what we don't want. But that's kind of the risk of when universities build these ties with foreign powers. They will self-censor because they think they might have to. And let's be clear, to our knowledge, no one from the Chinese government ever told Harvard to act this way. This was just a decision that was made by one or two people because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. And that's the thing I write a lot about in the book. It's not always just direct orders from officials like the Chinese government or other governments saying you have to do this. Sometimes it's the perception and belief on the side of the American partner that that's what's expected of them. So they do that anyway, even no one ever told them to. And so that's almost more disturbing in its own way because that's kind of more difficult to combat and learn about. So that was a pretty black mark on Harvard's record, in my view. And then a couple of years ago, there was also a very odd incident where a student very shortly, I think for about 30 seconds, disrupted a speech by a Chinese ambassador at some kind of event where he was speaking. She accused him of having blood on his hands. The disruption lasted for less than half a minute. And, universities do have the authority to remove disruption. No one's saying that Harvard can't do that. It can be appropriate in some contexts to remove disruptions and to punish them. But what happened was another student came up and physically grabbed and removed her from the room, dragged her out against her will. And the university actually logged that incident as assault. But the student who very shortly disrupted the Chinese ambassador received a 3-day probation. The student who dragged her out, and which the university repeatedly said was a violation of policies on assault, he did not receive any punishment, and he actually got an apology because a bunch of people had criticized him online when the video went viral, and they said the internet has punished him enough already. There are we have no reason to believe that there was some kind of warning that the disciplinary process should go that way. But it's again a decision made on the part of a university that you wonder, why did they think that this was the appropriate course of action? And to answer a question about, as opposed to bad actors, good actors, unfortunately, we don't have too many of those. But I think one example that was good was at Purdue University. There was a student there who was a Chinese international student, was a very open and loud dissident, especially on the internet. He was writing about Tiananmen a lot, attending Tiananmen memorials. This was about 3 years ago, maybe. And his peers were actually threatening him. They said they were going to report him to Chinese security forces to get him and his family in trouble at home. He faced threats from the Chinese government as well. And Purdue's president at the time, Mitch Daniels, when he was informed about it, he actually spoke out against it. He said, "This isn't acceptable at our university." And that's shockingly rare, unfortunately, for university leadership to recognize that. And I think there are some reasons we can get into why that is, but a lot more bad actors than good on this issue.
So I mean, it sounds like, Sarah, the students in these cases who are most harmed are actually, Chinese students, foreign Chinese students who are here, particularly dissidents, their families. I mean, I guess we'd also say that, American students or other students suffer insofar as, speech is being censored, either self-censored or censored due to pressure. But I mean, is that a fair assessment, or do you think is there something different?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. And ultimately, the people who suffer most, as you said, are the students, some of whom I've spoken to, who have received panic phone calls from their parents saying the government has found out what you did on campus and they're threatening us. It's I think difficult for a lot of us who come from a background living in a free country to imagine what that must be like, because you wrote an essay or posted a tweet that your family's saying they might go to prison and you might too if you come home. They suffer the most, absolutely. And part of the reason why I think it's difficult for people to learn about these stories is a lot of them don't speak publicly about this because they fear that if they tell the world what's happening, it'll become even worse and there will be even more threats and even more censorship. We don't have a great sense of exactly how many people this is happening to. But we do know it's happening to dissident students from China. And we do know that other students know that it's happening and say, "I don't want any of that. I'm going to shut up." And it's, I think a rational conclusion for them to make. And there are a lot of people who also suffer. I think academics who aren't students but who study, issues relating to China, who want to be able to travel to China for research. They also have a lot of incentive to self-censor too. And ultimately, this limits what all of us can know, what all of us can hear. If there's debates about China being censored on your campus, being limited on your campus, you're actually missing out on a lot of knowledge about what may be or already is the world's number one greatest power. I think that's a big deal if our institutions of knowledge are not even able to, host basic discussions about, what might be the biggest superpower of this century.
So what exactly, I mean, that part of it, I guess, if I'm an American university, the ability to actually, what can they do to counter this kind of pressure? Because if the pressure is being applied back in China when these students return and to their families, I don't know what I could do as if I were a dean at some American university, right?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Part of it is that this is actually happening to students when they're here in the U.S. That's actually where a lot of these threats are coming from. So students who are on American campuses facing these kinds of threats right now. But still, that's a difficult challenge. How do you stop security forces in another country from threatening your students? You can't stop those security forces, of course, but you can do a few different things to help. One of the things I've heard from students who are facing these kinds of things is that they won't even go to their universities to report it because they think that, oh, my university has a Confucius Institute, my university has a campus in China. They're not going to pick me over protecting that financial asset. So as a start, universities need to make clear that they're not going to prioritize their financial agreements, their opportunities abroad over the rights of any single one student on their campus. But right now, I think a lot of students don't feel that way. For example, I mentioned Purdue, Mitch Daniels. It's rare for a university president to talk about these kinds of threats that their students are facing because it's really awkward to say, a foreign government is threatening the rights of our students. And also, we have 20 different ties to that government. It's awkward to point that out. And so I think there's just a total denial or lack of interest in acknowledging the subject. Just as a baseline, universities should have free speech commitments that they can rely on in times of need. If you have a student group coming to you saying you need to censor my peer because he criticizes the Chinese government and that's offensive to me and hurtful, don't have policies that allow for censorship of speech just because it's hurtful or offensive. That's a pretty simple one. And I also think there are a few things that universities can do when students are just starting out. If you're a freshman incoming from another country, it's a great idea for a university to just tell you what to do if you're facing these kinds of threats. But another thing I would really love to see is some kind of tech training for students to learn how they can protect their anonymity on the internet. A lot of the threats we've seen against students have been over what they posted on the internet. So if we can find a way to at least start having them understand better ways to protect themselves online, that could actually be a pretty good start. So yeah, we can never stop, as a university dean, you can't stop the Chinese government from committing human rights abuses, but you can figure out ways that your own university can respond to what's happening on your campus. And I think there are some options there.
We've got a couple of questions. We try to sort of approach one. Are there instances where the foreign students, this is in the U.S., try to recruit American students to join them in trying to ban criticism of their home countries? Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with circumstances where they have explicitly said we want to have American students take part in this, but sometimes student groups like the CSSA, they will post open letters. They'll send it to the campus community saying, will you sign our open letter asking the university to act against this kind of speech? That's what happened at Brandeis University, for example, where students were sharing a letter asking them to cancel a Zoom panel about abuses against China's Uyghur community. So I'm not sure if there is, a concerted effort to recruit, all students to be a part of this campaign, but I don't think it would be unwelcome.
And then there's another question, and I'm going to take the prerogative of kind of rephrasing it because it fits into the next thing I wanted to discuss, which is the only solution here basically some kind of federal law or regulation that would dramatically restrict the number of foreign students in the U.S. And I wanted to tie that to what are you seeing in terms of recent developments, these recent months, recent years, and in particular, has there been a reduction in number of foreign students in the U.S. given what's been going on with the current administration, and how is that all impacting the censorship issue?
Yeah, so I realize this might come as a surprise given everything I'm saying, but I'm a bit of an optimist about the power of international students being able to come to the United States and have a place where they can come speak freely. And I'm uncomfortable with efforts to use the border that way to solve this problem when I'm not sure that's something that is the appropriate lever to pull in this instance. But it's definitely been a real roller coaster the past couple of years. First with COVID, that really was starting to mess with international student movement, and then with the second Trump administration, it's funny, we're seeing very mixed messages on what the administration even wants on this front anyway. What they've been saying, for example, in the agreement that they tried to get universities to sign was capping international student admission at 15%. And a lot of universities rejected that. Some rejected it. I think that's still a little bit up in the air, that the compact, as it was called. So at least on that front, there's been a clear effort from the administration to limit the presence of international students. But then, sometimes we get comments from Trump saying that he wants 600,000 Chinese students to be here, which would be quite an increase from the current number of students from China on campuses. So it's not really clear exactly where things are going to be headed on that front, but we definitely saw a bit of a dip. Over the summer, especially when we had a lot of concerns about students being kicked out for tweets, for op-eds, since we know that's happening as well. So it's uncertain. I think we are still going to be having large numbers of international students coming to the US. What the makeup might be could possibly shift. I think we're going to see, and already are seeing, students from India, being the largest presence of international students in the US. So it's unclear exactly where things are going to go, but we're in for a bit of a roller coaster for the next couple of years at least.
So there's no core. So I don't know if this is just anecdotal or some more a broader uh, thing going on, but you're seeing a lot of Muslim students from Muslim countries who've written items that are kind of critical of the United States or Israel or the West being banned from the U.S. But I gather that's not happening to Chinese students.
Not to my knowledge, or not to the extent that we're seeing with people who have been very involved in speech about Palestine, about Israel. This is something that FIRE has been very involved in over the past year, because we actually filed a lawsuit in August against Marco Rubio over these viewpoint-based deportations. There's been a lot of recent news about Ramesa Ozturk, for example, who was a student at Tufts University, who the government was saying a lot of things about, but ultimately it became clear they did just deport her, or attempt to deport her, over an op-ed. And that's the kind of thing we don't want. The reason why I wrote this book was in part because I was so disturbed at what was happening to international students who I think saw the US as a place where they could finally, maybe for the first time in their lives, speak freely. And so to have the federal government chip away at that so aggressively, I think has been really dangerous for this cause of keeping the US and its campuses as places that are free and open, even if often uncomfortable and unpleasant for a lot of different reasons, for a lot of different kinds of speech. We still want to protect that because there's great opportunity and promise that comes from that.
Sarah, we've been getting at this a little bit, but I think it's fair to say that the last couple of years have done a lot to upend the world of the book that you wrote, and probably challenge some of the key assumptions that you went into the project with. Among others, perhaps, the ecosystem of international student participation in U.S. higher education may not, is probably going to be pretty steady, and not see, maybe not some of the seismic shifts might not be the right word, because I think it may be a little too early to tell exactly what the effect on international student participation is. But there's a lot more talk of banning banning students from entering the country based on their viewpoints, wanting to see students' social media accounts. Um, calls to reform or scrap the H-1B visa program, threats to uh, limit or revoke entirely universities' abilities to enroll international students, but also at the same time, um, you know, there's much more of a question about how reliable a partner the federal government is going to be in terms of things like research funding. And I know at MIT that has had them looking internationally for new partnerships, which can which can push in the other direction in terms of maybe one day putting them in the position that you see some of the universities ended up in your book. So I wonder, if you're starting this project today, what are some of the new assumptions? What are some of the new major realities that you see that you would have to that help form the backdrop of the book?
Well, the funding question is definitely a key one. And earlier you asked me, does it seem like there's a shift from universities perhaps saying, okay, this has gotten really messy, and maybe let's try to look away from this kind of international expansion for a bit. If we continue these funding threats in the U.S., universities aren't going to say, okay, I guess we'll just stop. No, they're going to look for funding elsewhere. And where do you think they're going to look? Well, we know at minimum places like Saudi Arabia, places like the UAE, places like Qatar, these things aren't just going to stop. So it's sort of been a little bit baffling to see, um, from the federal government, these two, ideas that seem to be happening at the same time. Of we want to stop universities from engaging abroad because there's a lot of risk, which there is, but also we want to. Play games with the funding and sometimes revoke it in ways that are not legal or constitutional. Those things don't really coincide very well. And universities are going to, I think, fairly say, okay, we're going to have to look somewhere else for funding if it's such a risky bet. So that's definitely, part one of how I would analyze things differently. But one thing that I do think is actually pretty interesting, when this book was essentially finished this time last year, it was with the publisher. It was, it's a slow process getting the books out the door. But I was thinking, there's so much I wish I could add in here. There's so much happening right now with international students, with Trump and the federal government. Maybe I'm not, I need to find ways to, tie these things together. But I actually think that the things I talk about in the book, what some might call institutional cowardice, we're seeing it actually with the federal government sometimes too. We've seen universities to either protect funding or to appease political pressure to agree to censorship for the government that they shouldn't and shouldn't have to. And so, it's not really so different when you look at, what's been happening with the Chinese government, for example. It's universities making a choice to, what they think is a wise political decision to perhaps appease a government, to protect themselves, to protect funding sources. And it's just maybe a different government than we were expecting. But some of the themes here are the same. And so that's something I wouldn't change, but would love to expand on if I could write a new chapter tomorrow.
Yeah. One thing I know we've sold this as as a book about the impact on American campuses, but you actually have a whole chapter on the how this is impacting free speech on other campuses in other Western countries. And so, only because don't want this to be seen as an issue for the U.S. only, maybe you could just talk really briefly about the experience in I think you mentioned the UK, Canada. I mean, essentially, it was the Four Eyes from my perspective. Australia, Canada, English-speaking countries that usually profess to be pro-free speech.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think it's the reason why I wanted to make sure I had that chapter in the book was to help people understand that the severity of this problem. If we have essentially all highly ranked higher education around the world being susceptible to this, because all of the things that we've discussed happening in the U.S., international students being threatened, scholars feeling like they might have to self-censor, universities receiving demands that they censor speakers. All of these things have been happening everywhere on campuses. And sometimes there's even been direct acts of violence against speakers who have said things about the Chinese government. They've been punched in the face, they've been attacked, they've been threatened. And I think, maybe there's some solidarity to be had in that this is something that a lot of universities around the world have been responding poorly to. This is not a uniquely American problem. But it's really incredible, actually, the extent to which this is a problem in Australia. There have been a number of issues happening across Australia. There was one student at the University of Queensland, for example, who was essentially under investigation for years and years because of things he said about the Chinese government. And the university was actually employing in a position somebody from the Chinese consulate on the campus. And it's fascinating. And one of my favorite ones that's just a little story, but there's a few universities when they've dealt with these controversies about speech about China, criticism of the Chinese government, they've issued two apologies. One's been in English, where they, usually make some kind of statement in favor of free expression, academic freedom, and say what their values are. And then there's a Chinese language statement, which doesn't say any of those things, and it just expresses how sorry they are that they've offended people who are supportive of the Chinese government. And it's sort of incredible. And it's a great insight into the way that universities have trying to been playing to play both sides of this issue, to say, look, these are our values. We support free speech. And then when it's convenient, we're very sorry we offended the Chinese government. And so I think that's kind of a great way to look at it. Of they're trying to find ways to appease everyone, and ultimately they're kind of failing in every way.
So, Peter, I guess there's a few minutes left here. Unless you have more questions, I was going to actually ask Sarah to lay out her solutions in the next 7 minutes.
If there might be time for me to ask one, I think it can be a brief question, but then I'm happy to let you get to it.
Yeah.
Sarah, a country that does not get more than a couple of relatively glancing mentions in the book is India, which, given its size, given its population, given its, given the increasing size of its educated population, et cetera, seems to be a country that is poised to make an enormous splash in international higher education. Many of their best and brightest come to America's universities for their educations. But it also has a number of, elite IITs, a number of other great universities, and it has, a more, maybe a more nationalist government than it has had in recent years, which I can see using higher education as as a tool for influence. And so I wonder, do you see them making some of the same moves that that we've talked about from the Gulf states, from China? But also, is it a country that American universities have pursued a lot of partnerships with, like the others we've discussed?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and that's one that I definitely see starting to fulfill this role more and more. And we actually already have some evidence of that. There have been some lawsuits on U.S. campuses from some groups that are supportive of Prime Minister Modi and his government and his party, suing academics in the U.S. for their research. And so we're starting to see those stories pile up. And one thing that was especially notable to me was during the farmers' protests in India years back. An Indian consulate in Canada wrote a letter to a high school because they didn't like the way that this high school was talking about the protests that were taking place in India. And it was kind of just the playbook that I had been seeing from Chinese consulates 20 years ago. Writing a letter, contacting an institution to say, why are you talking about our issues this way? This isn't right. You need to fix this. And so that's absolutely something that I expect to see more and more. And there's obviously a lot of pressure on universities to decouple from China. Sometimes for very good reason, and that's coming from the federal government. And I think we obviously have a much healthier relationship with the Indian government, at least this administration does. And so the risk that there might not be as much pressure on universities if they want to pursue expansion there, I think that might be a more politically friendly thing for them to do. Whether that's something we'll see a lot of, I'm not sure. But we are we do have a large number of Indian students in the US. So, as that increases, I think there's, every day there's a bigger risk that those issues that the Indian government's censorship preferences are going to start being, an issue and something that we have to contend with on campuses.
Great. And now, per John's question, you have about 5 minutes to solve the problem of your book.
Good, that's exactly the amount of time I need to fix.
You're cracking.
So as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a few things that can be done. Some of the solutions I mentioned, specifically regarding international students, better protection, better education, make sure they understand their rights and what they can do to defend them. Obviously, with what we talked about, with what's happening, with our own government and international students, that's become a good bit more complicated. And I would need an hour just for that alone. But there's a lot of things I think that can happen, at least on the university side. Number one, you need to have viewpoint neutral free speech, academic freedom commitments. You need to be able to stand by those. If you have rules that say we're going to censor speech, if it's hurtful to the campus community, guess what? The campus community is going to ask you to use that policy when their feelings are hurt. So you need to not have policies that can be exploited ultimately as a censorship tool for a foreign power. That's a pretty simple one. And for public universities, which are bound by the First Amendment, that's your legal requirement anyway. So just stick with that. And we also need to have universities reporting, foreign funding. This has been a real problem for a number of years at this point. There's been billions of dollars in unreported funds from foreign powers coming into American universities, and it does make it very difficult to have a clear sense of exactly which universities are receiving the most funding, who might be facing pressure to censor, why universities might be conducting themselves a certain way. And so that was something that the first administration, the Trump administration, definitely ramped up, dropped off again during Biden. It's ramping up again now with the second Trump administration. So we'll see where that ends up in the coming years. But it's something that we need to actually require universities to be reporting. And when it comes to universities' foreign entanglements, this is something we hit on a lot earlier, but transparency and honesty. You need to be clear about what's actually happening in your foreign campuses, and you can't make promises that you can't keep. So I would love for universities to say we want to defend academic freedom, we want to defend free speech in our campus in Dubai. I want them to do that, but I want them to say, and here's what we're going to do if we face a threat to that. They need to have really clear and public rules about what they're going to do when they get a government order to censor speech. At minimum, we need to know that you're not going to silently censor on behalf of a foreign power and never tell anyone about it. So that's an easy one. And then most importantly, I think they need to commit to leaving partnerships, agreements that that violate policies or that violate promises to an extent that they find intolerable. If you have a foreign power saying you can't discuss human rights in your classroom, maybe you should not be partnering with that foreign power at all. And it's time to admit that, that partnership was a failure and that your values are worth more than whatever money that brings in. Those are I snuck those in as quickly as I could, but those are the big places where I would start. Just a transparency and honesty and a willingness to put your values first would be a really good place to start.
Thank you, Sarah. That was terrific. So I think we've come to time. Sarah, thank you very, very much for spending this
Thank you
time with
so
us
much
and
for having me.
helping educate us on this very, very important subject. Peter, pleasure as always, and I look forward to more collaborations with our friends at the other end of Cambridge. Thank you all. Thanks to the audience for joining. Thanks for your questions. Really appreciate your input and your attention. I do recommend Sarah's book to you if you're looking for something to read. And please, both Harvard and both the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech group and the MIT Free Speech group have many events and newsletters, and urge you to take advantage of our various offerings. So, thank you,
Thanks
everybody.
very much, John, and thanks very much, Sarah. Really enjoyed the discussion. I've been looking forward to it, and it absolutely delivered. And seconded, do find yourself a copy of Sarah's book. You won't regret it.
Okay,
Thank you.
take care.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.